On the road to Emmaus, from Luke chapter 24, verses 13 through 35. In our lesson today, we want to find out, what did the Emmaus disciples blank about blank? Well, obviously they did something, and it was about a certain person. I'll give you a hint. It's the person in the picture. So I'm sure you can probably figure that out. But as we're doing our lesson today, we'll see if we can find out what the aim of our story is. Late in the afternoon of Easter Sunday, two of Jesus' followers were walking to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking to each other about all the things that had happened to Jesus during the past few days. And while they were talking, Jesus himself came up to them and began walking along with them. But although they saw Jesus, God somehow kept them from recognizing him. Jesus asked the two disciples, "What are you discussing so seriously as you walk along?" They stopped and stood there, looking sad and discouraged. One of them answered, "You must be just about the only person in Jerusalem who doesn't know about the things that have happened here in the past few days." "What things do you mean?" asked Jesus. "Why, the things that happened to Jesus of Nazareth," the disciples explained. "That's what we're talking about. He was a mighty prophet from God who performed wonderful miracles and taught with great power. But the leaders of our people arrested him and then took him to Pilate to have him sentenced to death and crucified. All along we had hoped that he was the promised Savior who would set Israel free. But how can we keep on hoping now? It's already the 3rd day since he died and was buried. And then earlier today, some women gave us a real shock so that we don't know what to think. This morning they went to Jesus' tomb, but his body wasn't there. They told us they'd seen some angels who told them that Jesus had risen from the dead. Then Peter and John went to the tomb to check all this out. They found the tomb empty, just as the woman had said, but they didn't see Jesus. Then Jesus said to the two disciples, "How slow you are to believe all that God's prophets had said. Don't you see that these things had to happen? Didn't the scriptures clearly prophesy that the Savior would suffer, die, and then rise again before he could enter into his glory?" So in other words, Jesus is telling them, listen, I know that this is all bad and it was awful what you just saw, but this was God's plan. I think that's a great point for us to realize that sometimes things are pretty awful and they don't make sense, right? And we don't get it. But remember what we've always said, that God's ways are not our ways, and we don't see everything the way God does. So now Jesus is going to explain to them, hey, this was bad, but it had to happen. And here's why. Then Jesus explained the writings of Moses and the other Old Testament prophets. He pointed out to them everything that the scriptures had prophesied about himself. He explained that the Savior had to suffer and die to save all people from their sins. By this time, they were close to the village of Emmaus. Jesus acted as if he meant to keep on going. But the two disciples begged him, "Oh, stay with us as our guests. It's getting late and the day is almost over." So Jesus went home with them. When they sat down to eat, Jesus took some bread and gave thanks for it. He broke the bread into pieces and gave some to each of them. Instantly, they recognized that he was Jesus, their risen Savior. But the very next moment, his place at the table was empty. He had vanished from their sight. The surprised disciples looked at each other and said, "Didn't we feel our hearts fill with hope and joy as he walked with us on the road and explained the scriptures to us?" Eager to share their good news, they got up at once and headed back to Jerusalem. They found the disciples and some other followers of Jesus gathered together. They listened as the disciples had some good news of their own to report. It is true, the Lord has risen. Peter saw him. We've seen him too, exclaimed the two disciples. Then they described what had happened on the road to Emmaus and how they had recognized Jesus when he broke the bread. So in our lesson, we wanted to find out, what did the Emmaus disciples learn about Jesus? And our truth is, the Emmaus disciples learned that Jesus is the promised Savior who died and rose from the dead, as the Old Testament prophesied. So everything that was talked about in the Bible came true. And Jesus truly was, or is, also the Son of God who died for all of us.